Hi, this is Muho again, and I want to continue with the My Teacher's House series. In the next part of the interview with Edward, I talk about my experiences at two formal training monasteries. One of them is Hoshinji, a traditional Soto training monasteries where you can get your license if you want to become a Zen priest and maybe take over a Japanese Zen temple in the future. And the other one is Tofukuji, one of the main Rinzai temples, which serves the same function in Rinzai Zen. So the young Rinzai monks go there to get their license and be authorized as Zen priests. I never really wrote about my experiences in these two Zen temples in the English language, even in the adult practice series. Although at one point I wrote a lot about my own experiences, but it was usually about Antaiji. I never got to the point to talk about the experiences in the Rinzai temple, although probably I wouldn't be sitting here without this 1 year that I spent in Tofuguchi. I found, and I still find it quite complicated and difficult to talk about this experience. I wrote about it for the first time in German language about 12, 13 years ago, and it was extremely difficult for me to write about it at that time. That book is coming out in 2 weeks in a new edition in German, and I extended that chapter that is concentrating about this experience in Rinzai Zen. It's now about double of the length, and I found it easier now that it's already 25 years ago than when I wrote about it for the first time. It was only 10 years or so, and one reason I found it difficult to write about was that, there was so much happening in that monastery that conflicted totally with my and probably almost everybody's image of what Zen is all about, especially the violence. I hadn't seen anything like that in Antaiji. In the books by D.T. Suzuki and by Shunryu Suzuki, nobody talked about that kind of stuff. And it probably also has to do with my upbringing. I was born in Germany in 1968. When I entered school, I was 6 years old, 1974. So it was after the students' movement had ended. And my school was a very new school in Germany. It had been built maybe 2 years before. And it was connected to, in Germany, it's called a Gesamtschule. It was a new model. Usually in Germany, when you're 10 years old, you finish grade school, and then you have to decide if you want to go to high school or if you do only the minimum education, or there's two other options, but only if you go to high school, you can also advance to university. So at a very young age, people are separated from age 10 on. The kids that will eventually go to high school have not much contact with kids that come maybe from a working class environment, and they themselves and their parents decide that there's no need to send my kid to college in the future. And the idea of this new school model is we let the kids study together for a longer time. And if people want to graduate at age 15, 16, then they can do it. And the people that go on to high school graduation and then they go to university, they stay longer in the school, but they study together in the same classroom. So it was a new school model. It was kind of a leftist idea that people shouldn't be separated, but everybody should get same education for a longer time. And because it was a new school, there were lots of young, motivated teachers that had just left university, and they were in their 20s. A lot of them were in their 20s, and they had also of these student movement ideas in their head that they would create a new society. I think in the late 60s there was still this idea that the students would start a revolution and change the world at once. But then in Germany there was the saying of the march through the institutions. So people realized the revolution won't happen, but maybe we can do it step by step. We are still young. We're gonna become teachers, we're gonna become lawyers, we're gonna become politicians, and then we're gonna change the world in 20, 30 years. It's going to be a different world. And, well, who knows? Maybe in a way they succeeded. I don't know. Anyway, so in school I had these young, motivated teachers, and one thing that education concentrated on, and that's something that obviously hadn't been taught at German schools so much until the late 60s, was the Holocaust. The history of Nazi Germany and everything that happened, and everything that people obviously didn't talk about a lot for 20 years. People obviously tried to pretend that it never really happened, or, well, it happened, but let's go on with normal life. So one of the first books that we read, or the teacher read to us, was Anne Frank's diary, for example. So in German class you would read stuff like that. We had a religion class, we would hear about that. In history class the teachers would concentrate on that. And in Germany there's the saying of secondary virtues that also came up, I think, late maybe in the 70s. So Germans sometimes they praise themselves, or they're praised by others, for example, for their punctuality. When you go to Japan you realize, well, Germans are actually not so punctual. But Germans think of themselves of being punctual, they are orderly, they keep things clean, they are disciplined, and a lot of other things. And in the 70s people said, well, great, all of these might be virtues, but they are secondary because you can run a concentration camp with all of these virtues. You can be punctual, you can be orderly, you can be clean, all of that, and you can still run a concentration camp. Maybe it even helps to run a concentration camp with all of these virtues. What we need in the futures are not kids that are punctual or self-disciplined or orderly. We don't need kids that follow orders. What we need are kids that won't make a second Holocaust happening. And probably about 100 years ago, there was still like a physical, how do you say, punishment at schools, at public schools. I could imagine that my parents and my grandparents were still objected to that kind of thing, but I never witnessed myself that in a German school somebody would be slapped in the face, for example, or beaten. It would be, at that time in the 70s, it would have been a big problem. In the 80s as well. Sometimes on the radio there was news that in Japan a teacher would beat a kid with a stick and the kid died, and that would even be broadcast in Germany on the radio, and I was listening to that and I would say, what? How is that possible? That's a civilized country like Japan, and the teachers beat kids to death. I doubt that it happened on a regular basis in Japan, but there were cases like that, and it's obviously people of my generation in Japan, they witness physical violence even at school, like slapping in the face would not be something completely out of the question, or things like that would happen. And if you went through Japanese education system, middle school, high school, then that junior listens to their seniors unconditionally is taken for granted. So even if the senior is just 1 year above you, you have to listen to him or her. And none of that I learned in Germany, or none of that existed at the time in Germany, and I think it still doesn't exist. If you think that your teacher is wrong or your seniors are wrong, you can talk back and you will discuss it. And probably to a certain degree that's also the case in a Zen center, that you don't have to follow the teacher unconditionally, neither in the West nor in Antaiji. In Antaiji there was always a certain hierarchy, and people gave you orders and you were expected to follow those orders, but it wasn't that forceful. If you had the idea that maybe things were, as I talked about the last time, were insufficient, well, you were able to voice that, and sometimes people would listen, sometimes we wouldn't listen, but you could say things, and there was no slapping. Uchiyama Roshi was the guy who said we won't use the Kyosaku at Antaiji anymore, because, I mean, you sit. If you sleep, it's your practice. You have to take care yourself of your Zen practice. We don't have somebody who patrols and makes sure that everybody's sitting straight and not sleeping, as they have in many other monasteries. Or basically most of the training monasteries, they have the wake-up stick, and in the West, often it's the case that you can do gassho and then you receive the stick. In Japan, you don't do gassho if you want to receive the stick. The guy decides whom he hits. Usually it's the people who sleep. So I went through this traditional training and I found it difficult to describe it, express it in a way that does not make it sound like I was the victim of this completely anti-Buddhist treatment. How is it even possible that this still exists? I don't want to write it in this way. On the other hand, I also did not want to be too protective of it. In my case, I don't want to miss this 1 year in the Rinzai monastery. I could imagine that I would have quit being a monk without this 1 year. It worked. I think it worked in my case. On the other hand, I wouldn't want to do it to others, or it wouldn't be possible. Even now in Japan, things are changing. Things are changing during the last 20 years. Whenever people get seriously hurt, or every couple of years there actually happens an accident and people die during training, it becomes a big problem now. And now with smartphones all around, people, of course, the monks are not allowed to have smartphones, but still, you can smuggle a smartphone in, and if things like that get recorded, it would be a problem. It would be a problem. It becomes a problem also at the schools, also at the sumo training centers. In the sumo world, it's basically the same. People are hurt during training, not because of the sumo wrestling, but because they are beaten by their seniors. And if that becomes public, it becomes more public now. It becomes a problem now. So things are changing in Japan as well. And in the West, you couldn't do it like this right from the start. It would be impossible. Fortunately, I would like to say, fortunately, it's not possible to do it like this in the West. But it's not necessary as well. I mean, in Antaiji, in my view, it works the way we do it there. And at the time of the Buddha, I don't imagine that the Buddha went around with a stick beating his students. I could imagine that it was quite different at the time of Dogen. Although Dogen also, in his pure standards for the Zen community, at one point, he says, if a senior beats his junior, he should punch him not more than 10 times. And of course, somewhere in the Zuimonki, there's also the story of Dogen's teacher in China slapping his students with his slippers, and then at one point apologizing to his students, crying, "That's sorry that I need to do that, but I hoped to motivate you in the training." Okay, so much maybe about my difficulties to write about it. Or a little bit more. After the German book came out, I was afraid that people would be totally shocked by this chapter. And some people were shocked, but it didn't really cause as much of a stir as I had been afraid. Sometime later, about 10 years ago, the German book I wrote about 12, 13 years ago, 10 years ago, I wrote my first book in Japanese. And it took me 2 years to write, 7 chapters. But this one chapter about the Rinzai monastery, this one chapter is about 30 pages long. It took me 6 months to write these 30 pages. I tried to write at least one sentence per day. And often I couldn't write more than that one sentence. But it helped to at least write one certain sentence per day, so that I knew that at the end of the month I would have at least 30 new sentences, and thus I finally got through it. Again, I tried to, or my point was not to paint me there as a victim, also not to paint things that are black-white, but I try to do it in a well, even humorous, slapstick way, which is possible in Japanese because people, well, they know, they have been to kind of similar experiences at school, and they actually expect Zen training to be that way. There's this book that I mentioned the other day, 2 days ago, Eat, Sleep, Sit, My Year at Japanese Most Rigorous Zen Temple. Eat, Sleep, Sit is a literal translation of the Japanese original title, while the subtitle is probably added by the publisher. Each Zen training monastery. And as I said the other day, there's 30 something in Soto, there's 30 something in Rinzai. They are discussing now reducing the number. Most of these places try to think of themselves as the most rigorous one. So there's no agreement about which is really the most rigorous one. But in Soto, well, Eheji would be considered by most to be maybe the most rigorous one. And well, this book is about the experience in Eheji. Kaoru Nonomura is the pen name of the author, and he spent 1 year at that monastery. I think he succeeded quite well in describing this experience. And the English translation came out 11 years ago. I didn't know the book at the time. I came across it about maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago on some internet forums. At the time, I had the impression that people who had read the book in English were completely shocked and agreed that this is not Zen, this is not Buddhism. So I was surprised to find, I will put links below this if you're watching this on my blog. If you're watching this directly on YouTube, you find a link to my blog, and then you find the links to the book reviews on my blog. I was surprised to see that, for example, on Amazon, right now it has 50 ratings and 4.5 stars. So the big majority of the reviewers obviously agree it's a good book. Which surprises me, because what he writes in this book is completely different what you usually would expect from a Zen monastery in the West. And it's also different probably from what you find in Antaiji and what you find in other monasteries where many foreigners go in Japan. For example, at my time, I went, after the Rinzai monastery, I went to Hoshinji, and when I went there, there were 3 other foreigners who had been there for 2 decades each. So when I went there, we were only 4 foreigners, but until 10 years ago or so, there had been lots of foreigners. There was another temple in the same town called Obama, is the name of the town. There's nothing to do with Barack Obama. And only 5 minutes by foot, there was another temple, Bukkokuji, which was just like Antaiji, an exception in the sense that Bukkokuji, well, it had a small parish, but the focus was not so much on doing funerals, but on doing Zen practice. But at the same time, Bukkokuji, unlike Hoshinji, was not a priest seminary, so you couldn't get your license there. Still, Bukkokuji attracted a lot of foreigners at the time. And I think now there's been a great decrease in monks, both at Hoshinji and Bukkokuji, because the roshis are very old or they have already died. Most foreigners now, when they want to do formal training in Japan and they want to do it Soto style, they go to Toshoji in Okayama. Most of the monks there are foreigners, and if they want to do it Rinzai style, they go to Sogenji, which is also in Okayama. And because there are so many foreigners in these places, the atmosphere is kind of different from what I found in Rinzai. Antaiji is not really aiming at Western style practice, but Antaiji, of course, also, maybe because of the long tradition of having Westerners there, but also because of certain things that Uchiyama Roshi changed. Antaiji as well is quite different. So if you want to know how life in a traditional Zen monastery really is, this book eat, sleep, and sit will give you a certain idea. Well, if you can read Japanese, you can read my first book, or if you can read German, read the book that's going to come out in 2 weeks. I talk about this experience in detail, and I will also talk about it in the interview that I want to read now. First question by Edward. Could you speak about Hosshinji and why you went there? It's kind of a little bit strange that this question comes first, because I went to Hosshinji after I went to Tofukuji, so it was the second step. But he first asked me about Hosshinji, which is a traditional Soto monastery. My answer: in the past, they did koan practice with a specific aim to attain Kensho. So it's not so strong as it used to be, but there's the Sambo Kyodan organization in the West, founded by Yasutani Hakuon. And that was a Soto teacher who also did koan training. And for example, in Los Angeles, Maezumi Roshi and the teachers that were authorized by him, they come from this tradition as well, the White Plum lineage, I think it's called. It used to be quite strong. So in the West, Soto with koans used to be quite popular, and it comes originally from Hosshinji at the time. The Roshi who started the whole thing was Harada Sogaku. He went to a Rinzai monastery in Kyoto just like I did. He went to Nanzenji. Which is also the place where then the Roshi trained that taught me at Tofukuji. Either way, in the past they did koan practice with a specific aim to attain Kensho, which is standard practice in Rinzai, but not standard in Soto. Even though it's in the Soto Shu, when I went there, there was still some of the older students who did that koan training, but the Roshi didn't enforce it anymore. There were these Dokusan meetings, so you could meet with a Roshi, but not this, hey, do you have the answer to the question I gave you yesterday? Which you have in Rinzai, also in Bukkokuji, where Jay went. That and Hosshinji are in the same town, only 5 minutes away from each other. They stem back from the same Roshi, even though they don't like each other anymore. So Hosshinji and Bukkokuji are not on so good terms. Or, well, they don't like it if people go from one place to the other and visit each other. Bukkokuji is pretty close to Rinzai, even though it's Soto. Hosshinji is now more traditional Soto. Next question by Edward. During that time, did you return to Antaiji? And my answer: I was in touch. I went back to Antaiji once when I got a small holiday from Tofukuji, the Rinzai monastery, a week or so. After I left Tofukuji, I came here for a short period of time. It was when they were building this Zendo. At Hosshinji, I didn't get any holiday. So we're talking about the time from 1995 to 1997. I left Antaiji in the autumn of 1995. In January, there had been this big earthquake in the south of Hyogo Prefecture. Antaiji would be in the north of the prefecture, and thousands of people died at the time in Kobe, which was big news in Japan, and we would hear it on the radio. It was in the winter, so we didn't get the newspaper except once every couple of weeks, but then it was all over the newspapers. It was a big shock for myself, maybe less than the older monks who said, well, we've been doing this training for 5 years, 10 years, but what can we do for society there? All these people dying, we're sitting here in the snow. It went through people's mind, and it was also topic in the discussions after Dharma talks, and some people left because of that. And 2 months later, there was the Stalin attacks in the Tokyo subway, the Om cult, which styled itself as a Buddhist cult, killed, well, 12 people and thousands were injured because of the saline gas. And again, there was this discussion going on in the Japanese media and in the public. How is it possible that Buddhists or people that are genuinely striving for enlightenment would do that? And most of the traditional Buddhists would say, well, these own people, they are not Buddhists in the first place. So it has nothing to do with Buddhism. But then the second question is, well, then how come that so many young people at the time, like they had a huge following, thousands and well-educated people from the best universities that entered that cult. And it was because of these talented people that they were able to also somewhere in the basement create the saline gas to produce this deadly gas, while at the front also maintaining the spiritual practice and do yoga retreats and do meditation retreats and stuff like that. You needed a certain talent to do that, and Om and the guru there was called Asahara Shoko. He was obviously able to attract these kind of people. So the second question is, well, okay, so let's agree these are not Buddhists. It's some strange cult. How come that so many thousands of young, well-educated people end up there? Why don't they come to traditional Soto or Rinzai Zen, for example? Or there's other schools in Japanese Buddhism, Shingon Buddhism, Tendai Buddhism. There would have been so many other options. How come nobody comes to Antaiji? And thousands go there. So, of course, you couldn't say that people at Antaiji or else in traditional Japanese Buddhism were directly responsible for the saline attacks, but indirectly, at least the monks at Antaiji felt a responsibility. Well, what have we done wrong, or what could we have done better to make it public that, hey, here, if you look for a way to practice, if you want to live your life in a different way than society expects you to do, well, there is Antaiji. Come here, come here. Obviously, Antaiji didn't reach these young people, and most of the other traditional Zen temples didn't reach. So in the autumn of 1995, these two events, in my case, were only peripherically related to my decision to leave Antaiji. But anyway, I left and I went to Tofuguji, and it was a big shock because, for one thing, it was this question, well, isn't this exactly the environment that I was told in school all the way to avoid? This is even more German than Nazi Germany. I mean, also in Antage, you're sometimes told to arrange your slippers, please, and to please switch out the light when you're the last person to have used the toilet. And in Germany, sometimes there's this punchline. The last one switches the light out. It's a punchline that tries to refer to people's jerkiness. It's considered jerky to tell somebody to switch the light out after they're the last one. And people would say, well, you can run Auschwitz that way. The last one switches the gas off. Okay, well, everybody knows that, but there are more important things in life. And when you go to the monastery, it's only about stuff like this. And then, so from 1995, the autumn until 1996, late summer, I spent in Tofukuji, and then I got out. And for 5 months, I built up a tent in the mountains, and I stayed by myself for 5 weeks. I didn't want to really see people, and I visited shortly in Antaiji. And then I went to Hoshinji. That was the autumn of 1996, and I stayed for another year in Hoshinji. During this 1 year, I didn't get any holiday. And next question by Edward. What made you want to return to Antaiji? So after these 2 years in late summer of 1997. And now I say, when I left for Tofukuji, so that would be autumn of 1995, I wasn't sure whether I would return at all. The only thing I knew then was that things were not working out. I didn't feel like going back to Germany or returning to university, which might have been options. So when the oldest monk said, why don't you try Rinzai for a year? I said, okay. That 1 year at Tofukuji was an eye-opener. After that, I felt that my place is Antaiji and my teacher is Miyaula. If I ever wanted to get Dharma transmission, I would get it from him, and not, for example, the Roshi at Tofukuji, who also seemed to like me a lot and expected me maybe to stay with him for a decade. But after a year, I didn't feel that my place was there. Although the Rinzai Roshi loved me, he was a nice guy, like a grandfather. Edward, you said it was an eye-opener. What do you mean? Muho, I realized all the stuff I had been complaining about here in Antaiji wasn't worth complaining about. In Tofukuji, you get up before 3 a.m. Then you do sutra chanting from 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. Then breakfast at 4:30 a.m. Then there's a Zen and the first Doksan meeting with the Roshi. So it starts very early, and usually it's the youngest monk, so that was me when I came there, was responsible of waking people up in the meditation hall. You sleep, everybody sleeps together in the meditation hall. You're the youngest one, you have to make sure that people are up at 3:50, 10 to 4 in the morning, but you're so exhausted. Well, you have this alarm clock, I have this watch with an alarm clock, but I needed to kind of wrap a towel around my head like this and put the alarm clock right here at my ear at night. Otherwise, if I just sitting the alarm clock by my head, I wouldn't hear it. I had to stick it right next to my ear so that I woke up at 3:50. And then wake everybody up so that they were ready for not 3:50, we're talking about 2:50 here. Sutra chanting started at 3 o'clock, so you wake up at 2:50 when other people would go to bed maybe. Most people at the time, there were 11 monks at the time, and most people had just come from university. They were 22, 23. My seniors were 24, maybe 25. I was 27 at the time. So my seniors were all younger than myself. They had just come from university, so for them it was a big change that they had to get up at the time they were used to get to sleep. Breakfast at 4:30, then there's zazen and the first Doksan meeting with the Roshi. You do zazen until the sun rises, so it changes with the season. In the winter it's longer than the summer. After sunrise you clean the whole temple precincts. That can take 2 hours because it's huge. Tofuji is a huge garden. Then you do takuhatsu until 10 a.m. which is kind of, unusual. Stores open in Japan usually around 10 a.m. But in the summer we would leave the monastery sometimes at 6 or 6:30 when people were still sleeping and try to get alms. And when people were actually going to shop at 10 a.m. we had already to be in the monastery. So from a business point of view it wasn't so clever to do takuhatsu so early, but that's tradition in Kyoto and it's part of the discipline. It's not so much about how much money you get. You do takuhatsu until 10 a.m. then it's lunch. So because you get up at 2:50, lunch is also quite early. At 10:15, 10:30 maybe was lunch. I think 10:15. We came back from takuhatsu, had to wipe our feet, and it was right at once. There was lunch. After lunch, the newest monks do toilet cleaning, while the older monks can take a nap. From 1 a.m. there is samu. So if you're one of the older monks, you have quite a long lunch break. If you're the newest one, you spend that break cleaning the toilets and stuff like that. From 1 a.m. there's samu, work. Or if the Roshi has guests, you have to cater for them. Dinner is around 4:30. And then around 5 p.m. there is a zen again until 9 p.m. Although I think that would also change a little bit with the seasons. In this winter, evening zazen started earlier than in the summer. Officially at 9 p.m. you lie down and sleep. But that is only a show. So at 9 p.m. there's a small ceremony where everybody spreads out their futon, gets into the futon, closes their eyes, and there's a monk with a stick patrolling and making sure that everybody is fast asleep. And then they switch out the lights. That's the show. You lie down for a minute or two, then get out of the futon. You take your cushion and then sit outside under the hondo roof facing the garden until 10 p.m. For 1 hour everybody lines up and sits at night. And that's not voluntary, but you have to do that. Then the oldest monk leaves and either goes to bed, or some of the older monks also enjoyed nightlife after that. They climbed over the wall and enjoyed themselves. And well, if you were the oldest one in the hierarchy, you're free to do whatever you want until 3 a.m. the next day. And if you're the second in the hierarchy, you're free to do whatever you want once the first monk isn't there anymore. So you have to see, what are your seniors doing? Are they there? Are you watching you? Are they watching you? And if they're not there, not watching you, you can do whatever you want. At 10 p.m. the oldest monk leaves. Then every 5 minutes the next in the hierarchy can leave. Sometimes people fell asleep and it took 10 minutes or so until they would leave and go to bed or climb over the wall. In my time there was around 11 monks, so it took 1 hour until I could go to bed. So around 11 p.m. That means you only have 4 hours to sleep. Actually a little less than that, because you have to get up at 10:50. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's less than 4 hours. Also, you have to memorize the sutras for chanting. The sutras that are chanted in Soto and Rinzai are mostly the same, but sometimes with some of the sutras, they stress them in a different way. That's, for example, with the Daihi Shindarani. In Soto it would be Namu Kala Tanno Tolaya Ya Namu Oliya Bolyo Kichi. And in Rinzai it's Namu Oliya Bolyo Kichi Shifulaya Fujisato Boya. And if you're used to the Soto style, that's a hard one. And you have to remember the Kannongyo and stuff like that. Certain Dharanis. That's, well, in Antaiji we don't chant sutras in the first place, but I knew lots of these from my time as a student in Berlin. In Berlin they did regular sutra service, so I knew part of that stuff. But for example, of course, the whole lineage that's also chanted from Shakyamuni to, in Soto it would be Dogen Zenji, but in Rinzai, of course, you chant the Rinzai lineage. So up to the 6th patriarch it's the same, but from then you have to learn all these new patriarchs' names and stuff like that. And you do that after 11 p.m. You have to do it at night. There's no time during daytime that you are allowed to study. You have to memorize the sutras for chanting in the first few months. The sutra chanting is done in a ridiculously fast way, like a machine gun, the mokugyo. You also have to learn how to do that, to, well, do it this machine gun way. That means that when you chant, it's hardly intelligible what is actually chanted. It sounds like all of the monks are just randomly roaring something. It sounds like gurgling, I say here. So you try to imitate these sounds, and they say, hey, you're not chanting fast enough. They're also quite free-willing. I think I tried to say freewheeling. I'll correct this. Freewheeling. With slapping you in the face. Whenever you do a mistake, you're slapped in the face. And that was the first big shock for me, because I didn't get that treatment in Germany. And in Germany, that was a complete no-no. You don't slap people in the face. Even parents usually don't slap their kids. Teachers don't slap their students. But in Japan, that happens. And that was only the beginning. Or sometimes they will punch you if you get the chanting wrong. So during the chanting, actually, people were punched or kicked, stuff like that. I saw people trying to get the mokugyo faster and faster and faster, while somebody, their seniors, were kicking them from behind. Basically, you have to stay up after 11 p.m. and use a flashlight to memorize the sutras. But if you only have 4 hours to sleep, even if you stay up until midnight, the next morning it's all gone. Your brain doesn't really work anymore. On the other hand, during the Zen, it's easy to let go of the thoughts. There's hardly any thoughts coming up. In Antaiji, there usually were either sexual thoughts, fantasies in my head, or rock and roll playing. And there, nothing comes up during the Zen. Well, but you're very sleepy, so it's all about staying awake, because otherwise you get beaten. And you get beaten a lot. So you have to sit there with a flashlight until midnight trying to memorize stuff, but things don't stick. They don't stick with you. For any mistake, for example, if your slippers are not straight by a millimeter, you get punched for that as well. Also, you can't go to the toilet without permission. And in the beginning, you have to eat and drink so much that you have to go to the toilet quite often. If things are busy or your senpai, so senpai is Japanese for senior, senior monk. If your senpai is in a bad mood, he says, no, you can't go to the toilet now. Then you have to eat this ridiculous amount of stuff during the meals. These 3 bowls filled with rice and 3 bowls of soup. And the pile, it's a lot. It's a lot of rice. The lowest one in the hierarchy, so that was me during the first 6 months, has to eat all the leftover rice, and the second lowest in the hierarchy has to drink all the leftover soup, so that's after the first 3 big bowls. In the beginning I had to eat all the rice, which was a lot, and in the summer I drank all the soup. I was lucky it was that way around, because, well, in the winter you don't want to take so much liquids when it's cold, while in the summer having to drink the soup rather than eat the leftover rice was better than the other way around. If it's the opposite, you have to eat all this rice in the heat and drink all this liquid when it's cold. When you have to eat all the leftovers, you have to go to the toilet quite frequently, because, well, and sooner or later you get diarrhea. Each time you have to ask your senpai for permission. If you're not allowed to go to the toilet, you have no choice but to shit in your pants. And that happened to me a number of times, actually. But then it's not, oh, please go take a shower and change your clothes. You have to somehow escape behind the hondo and dispose your pants and wash yourself at night in the pond. During the daytime there's lots of tourists. Watching the garden and saying how wonderful it is. And at night you go there to wash your behind. Or fulo, which is the bath, which in Antaiji we have almost daily, but there you have it only every 2 weeks. It was on the 14th of the month and then again on the 29th, I think, every 2 weeks. Ofulo for the monks at the bottom of the ladder means you have to wash the backs of your senpai. You have to first rub off the backs of the senior monks. Then they get into the bath for 10 to 15 minutes. They finish. You hand them the towel and stuff like that. Look at their watch and they say, oh, there's no more time, get out. So it often happens we were looking forward to get a bath after 2 weeks. And we were told, now there's no more time, get out. So sometimes you don't even have your ofulo. This means that when you go for takohatsu and it's the rush hour, like when we went, it was usually before the rush hour, but to get back at 10 o'clock, often when we returned, it would be rush hour. You enter a train and it's normally like a sardine can. Everybody knows that who's been on a Japanese train during the rush hour. You need to be lucky to get in the first place. And in the old days they used to have people to push people into the car. And it's like a sardine can. You can't move in there. But because we were stinking so much, when we went to Takuhatsu, we would enter a train and have more than enough space to stand. People were making space for us. Edward says, like a blast radius, and I say exactly. We didn't notice it anymore. You're always in this stink. I only have respect for the Roshi meeting us during Doksan. The Roshi at least twice a day were meeting these stinking young fellows, and there's quite some koans that also require a physical exchange. So I remember this one koan which was about some kind of beasts. And in many or almost all of the koans is about you become the koan, you become the thing. So when the koan is about a beast, it's all about you becoming the beast, and so you kind of make this kind of thing. But the Roshi says no. That's not enough. No, you're not there. It's usually at one point you do all these kind of demonstrations of how you are that beast. At one point the Roshi jumps at you and bites you in the thigh. And he does that even with the novices who haven't been in the bath for days and weeks. And yeah. Respect for that. A true bodhisattva. Then in the Zen, you are always sleeping because you are so tired. Everything is so surreal that you pass out the minute the bell strikes. The minute the bell strikes and the Zen starts. Sometimes people are already sleeping the next second. So there's always one person patrolling with a stick. That person is always busy because he has always somebody to beat. And when you sleep, you get hammered on. Usually it's 4 strikes in the summer and 8 in the winter. In the summer 2 on each side, left and right. In Soto usually, traditionally, they beat you only on the right side because on the left side you have the okesa. But in Rinza you sit with a raksu, and before you're beaten you have to take it off. In the summer 2 on each side, in the winter 4 on each side, which makes 8. Half on each shoulder. People take pride in how many of these sticks they can break. In sesshin, it could be 5 or 6 sticks they break. So in some sessions they broke 30 sticks, and these are, I think I got one here. No. Strange. I think I had some sticks sitting around here, but I don't see them. Anyway, I mean, they are serious sticks. Not so easy to break one of these, and they broke 30 or so in a week, and then they would complain that things are too lax here. There's Myoshinji, which is considered the most rigorous Zen monastery in Rinzai. They say, well, in Myoshinji they break 100 of these sticks in 1 week, and in our monastery it's only 30, so we have to be harder on the novices. Whatever. For the people that get beaten, it means that after a while the shoulders swell up and the skin breaks and you start to bleed. Takes a couple of days to get there, but it all gets purple, and at one point you don't have a neck anymore because it all swells up. And then the skin breaks and you start to bleed, and all people will notice when there's blood coming out of your robes. When that happens, it means they don't hit you on the shoulders anymore, they hit you in the belly, so you get hit from the front. In Rinzai you sit facing the person who beats you. You usually go like this and he beats you like this, but if you're bleeding he comes and beats you kind of, well, they call it a batting style. I like in baseball, like if he would beat you with a baseball, he beats your belly. You sit facing the room and the guy is hitting you in the belly like he's playing baseball. At first I thought this can't be real. It was like some crazy movie. But after 6 months I was still alive. Surprised but happy to be alive. It was an experience that was completely new to me because I was always a melancholic depressive when I was young. I was like Why did my mother have me? How much less suffering would it have been if she had aborted me when I was born? So it was always this question, okay, I'm living, but why? 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 Why can't I be dead instead? And this realization, I'm alive, and it's a miracle. It's a miracle. It's wonderful. After 6 months to still be here. I remember a conversation. I thought I also talked about this in the interview, but probably I didn't. So I was, for the first 6 months, I was at the bottom of the hierarchy, but there was the guy second from the bottom. He had come 2 or 3 days before me, and 2 or 3 days, well, they matter a lot in a Zen monastery. If you're 3 days later, you're the junior, and if you're 3 days earlier there, you're the superior, the senpai. But still, because it was only 3 days, there were things that I could talk about with him that I could not talk about with the guys who had come 1 year before me or 6 months before me. So at one night in the winter, we were sitting there facing the garden. Everybody else had already left, and I asked him, don't you think that life here is hell? Why do we do this to ourselves? It's hell. This is hell. It's so completely surreal. Or, like, coming from a German background, I was always kind of, making this comparison to a concentration camp. Why would I do this to myself? It's like a concentration camp. It's hell. And then my monk brother said, now you're completely exaggerating. What you say is so over the top. Imagine you were in hell. Would you have a cushion to sit on? Would you have a futon to sleep on? Would there be 3 meals a day served to you? Would you be allowed to lie down at night? And I didn't mention the concentration camp thing, but it's not that there's a systematic killing going on. And at night you had always the option to climb over the wall and escape. You had to sign, before you entered the monastery, you had to sign a paper saying, I'm not going to leave here before I attain enlightenment. But so you couldn't officially leave. Officially you had made this promise to not leave before you got the official seal of enlightenment by the Roshi. So even the monks that leave after 3 years to take over their father's temple because they don't have a seal of enlightenment, they have to take a break and return to their father's temple, and then this break extends eternally. So officially there's no way to leave the monastery, but there's always, everybody knows how to get over the wall. There was actually this wooden box standing at one spot of the wall, and everybody knew that's where the senior monks climb over the wall at night to enjoy city life. So it's not hell. In hell you don't have that option. In a concentration camp you wouldn't have had that option. So my Dharma brother reminded me after maybe 3 months or so, you're not in hell here. This isn't hell. So I said, you're right. It's more like a prison. And then he said, no, no, in prison you have more than 4 hours of sleep. In prison you don't have to eat until you vomit. You can go to the toilet if you have to. You don't have to sit zazen and are beaten when you move or sleep. In a prison, you can't leave whenever you want, but apart from that, in prison, you would be much better off. That was a small realization for me at the time, that Zen monastery, what you do to yourself, it's voluntary, but it's a little worse than prison, but still a lot better than hell. And the important thing is you can always leave. So it's basically the day-to-day challenge. Do I stay and give my all, or do I leave? These are the two options that you have. Okay. After 6 months at that place, I realized it is actually a miracle that I'm still alive. Wow, it is great. There's the sun out there and I can breathe. Of course, I have to ask my senpai each day if I can take a pee, but at the end of the day, I can even take a pee here. Isn't that wonderful? Then, when I thought back about my life at Antaiji, I was like, wow, I had this kind of first-class experience there at Antaiji. And I was complaining that I didn't have enough time for myself. Like from time to time, there's these kids that try to hitch a flight on a plane by hiding somewhere in the staircase of the wheels or so, and sometimes they survive. Usually they die, but clinging to the wheel in a staircase of a plane for several hours, if that's Rinzai Zen practice, then Antaiji is like sitting in first class. But I didn't realize that when I was in Antaiji. I had this kind of first-class experience there at Antaiji, and I was complaining that I didn't have enough time for myself. I had 8 hours at night to sleep, and I was complaining. I could decide whether I had enough rice and soup to eat. I didn't get force-fed till I shit my pants and beaten up for making mistakes. And in the winter, I got 3 months to study what I wanted. Wow. What a privilege. I felt a little bit ashamed that I had left Antaiji. Maybe I gave my teacher the feeling that I betrayed him. I thought I have to repay something there. I want to get back. So for me, it was pretty clear that I had to return. But I need to also invest 1 year to get my Soto license. So I'm going to do that right after Tofukuji, is what I told myself. So I spent that 1 year from 1995 to 1996. In 1996, I knew Antaiji is where I belong. But rather than go back and then take another year off to go to a Soto training monastery to get my license, I will first go to the Soto place and then get back to Antaiji. So after Hoshinji, I went back in 1997 with S, another monk from Antaiji who had, by chance, also decided to go to Hoshinji during that 1 year that I went. But then again, it wasn't easy. I thought I knew Antaiji is my place, but once I'm back, it wasn't easy. Again, there was the money-making scheme. So we were told, Antaiji has no money. I want you to solve that problem, the financial problems of Antaiji, without doing takuhatsu. You have any other option except begging. That's what our teacher told us. That's one of the topics of the past, my teacher's house series. So if you're not familiar with that, please go back. During the first 2 years, everybody except 3 people, including S, M, and K, were left. So all of the older monks at Antaiji left during those 2 years after I'd come from Oshinji, and then I was in the position of the first monk. And I don't know, maybe it was the confrontations with Watanabe, but Miyaura was drinking quite a lot. Not only after Zazen, but in the daytime, sitting in his room drinking. If you had a question for him during the day, say after lunch, he was already intoxicated. You wouldn't really want to talk to him. But there were few people to do all the work, so it was really hard. When the whole conflict with Watanabe got to the surface, and it was obvious something was going on, that he wanted Miyaura to leave, and that I was a card played in that game. Miyaura told me that Watanabe had said I was going to be his successor, and how come he didn't know about that, which of course I didn't know about either. So that was, I think, in 2001, in January or so, that I was called to the Hojo, which we call also the interview room in Antaiji. I think the first question is, well, what's your plans for the future? I was 32 at the time, turning 33. I'd spent almost a decade at Antaiji. So what's your plans for the future? And I said, well, I have no special plans. There's no special plans. Like Uchiyama Roshi talks about this 10 years, sit 10 years silently, and then another 10 years. I have no plans beyond that. And then he asked me, well, is your intention to become the next abbot of Antaiji? And I said, I don't really see how I could possibly do that job. And my teacher at the time said, I agree. I don't see you doing that job. Maybe you should lead a small group somewhere in the city with students attaining meditation classes. And then maybe I was the one who asked him, well, why do you ask in the first place? How come that we were talking about this right now? And he said, well, I got this letter from Watanabe Roshi, and he tells me that you're going to be the next abbot. How come that? I don't know about that. That's a decision that I have to make. How come that you and Watanabe are making this decision over my head? And I was totally surprised. I didn't know about that decision either. I didn't know that I was supposed to become the abbot, and I had no intention to become it, especially not against the will of my teacher. Although Watanabe is of course my teacher's teacher, but loyalty in Zen, as far as I understand it, is first to the teacher. And then, of course, also to the teacher's teacher, but you cannot, so to speak, jump over your teacher. I didn't know about that either. There was this deep insecurity, well, probably both on the side of Miyaura and myself. What is going on here? What is played here? Somehow I seem to be a pawn in a game that's played by somebody else, but I don't want to be that pawn in somebody else's game. He thought I had betrayed him with Watanabe, so then I said, I'm going to leave. So in January of 2001 I said, maybe it's better I leave. But right now, at the time, there were only 2 other monks, so I said, I'm going to leave in the summer, and Miyaura said, okay. That was in 2001. I had that conversation with him in January. There was only 2 other people practicing there, K and M. So I said I will leave in the summer and I hope there will be somebody until then. There was then this American guy that joined in the spring, I think it was. And Ula seemed to love him. Okay, so much for today. Again, a long video. Thank you for watching. And if you want to know more about how life can be in a traditional Zen monastery, once more I recommend in English Eat, Sleep and Sit by Kaoru Nonomura. I think he has been in Eheji, maybe just around the time I went to Tofuguji and Hoshinji, 1990s, early to middle 1990s, I would say. Quite interesting book. Of course, quite different also from Rinzai. Again, quite different from Rinzai, quite different from Antaiji. And again, I don't think that that's the way Zen is supposed to be. But in my case, and in the case of many other people, it had also positive effects. Interestingly. I mean, otherwise, this almost surreal style of practice would not have developed. On the other hand, it probably has no future, even in Japan. It has no future. There's this very famous book by Viktor Frankl. In English it's called Man's Search for Meaning. Originally it was written in German, but and you can buy it in Germany. But although, as I said, in the 70s and the 80s, my teachers would focus very much on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, I never had heard about that book during my time in Germany. I came across that book when I was in Hoshinji, and the Hoshinji was completely different from Tofuguji. I had lots of time for myself, and I could go to the library and read books. And Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning was one of the books I came across then. And once more, the experiences I had at the monastery are nothing to compare to what happened in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. But in a way, I think there was something similar, or people go through something similar in these situations where it's completely absurd. Life is completely absurd. Things don't make any sense. And well, that would probably be the point where Viktor Frankl would maybe say, well, that's when you need to realize that only you can make sense of life. And making sense of life doesn't really mean that you make sense of it. It means you have to accept it. You need to accept the situation and then make the best out of it. In my case, it was always this option. You stay or you leave. I stayed for 1 year and then another year in Honshinji, and then I got back to Antaiji for another 4 years. That also weren't easy. And after that I left for Osaka to build up my tent in the park. Probably that's gonna be the topic of one of the next sections in the interview. Okay, so once more, thank you. Thank you for watching. Have a good day and see you next time.